Decades ago, headless skeletons and corpses were discovered along the riverbanks of Nahanni Valley. Many people have also gone missing, so much so that the area is referred to as the Bermuda Triangle of Canada, though its actual name is more terrifying, as the Valley of Headless Men. Long before the arrival of the first European explorers, the Dene people avoided the region of South Nahanni Valley. The Dene believed it to be a cursed place with bad juju. It always seemed like there was a malevolent presence just hanging in the air, like something was watching you. Over time, a few brave or foolish native hunters, depending on your view, ventured into the valley in search of game, and surely enough, they had very bizarre encounters. Frightening shrieks and fearsome hairy giants only added to the valley's notoriety. However, according to the Dene tradition, the Nahanni Valley was once home to the Naha, a nomadic and warlike tribe living in the high mountains that frequently raided Dene settlements. People sometimes mix up the Naha and the Nahanni. They are not the same, and here's the difference. The Nahanni used some level of olden technology, and they were less primitive. But older accounts testify that their counterparts were downright barbaric. Some versions even describe them as cavemen or troglodytes. Before their infamous raids, the Naha warriors wore thick sheepskin robes and armored breastplates made from wood, and armed themselves with spears, axes, and stone-tipped knives. This was the routine. After leaving the valley, they scanned nearby rivers for the smoke of distant campfires. When the tribe found enemy camps, they swiftly descended the mountains through the woods. Most enemies were sitting ducks. Even if you discovered them at that point, it was too late. Once the raid was proven to be a success, they'd torture survivors, mutilate enemy bodies, execute children, and carry their wives and daughters into the mountains. One particular day, the Dene people could no longer take it. They had to do something. They had to fight back. They decided that an elite Dene war group would quietly head into the Nahanni Valley to remove the Naha threat permanently. In the depths of the night, the Dene warriors marched into Naha territory. With every silent step, it seemed like they were walking into a trap. There was no sign of anyone present. Now this was strange. A few minutes before this march, they had seen the sign of a distant smoke signal. But now, within the camp, nothing. With all weapons drawn out, the only thing that could be heard in the woods were insects and animal sounds. It was as if their enemies had vanished into thin air. The warriors all thought this was an ambush. They'd be dead any second now, so they fled back to the lowlands, and yet, the Naha were never seen again. Well, what happened? One prevalent theory as to their strange disappearance was that they were tracked down and killed. By whom? Well, that's not clear according to Dene lore. Many people believe they simply migrated. You see, back at the Dene raid, they had discovered war party artifacts that were too heavy to transport, so the Naha traveled 2,000 miles south and arrived at the deserts of the American Southwest, where they became the Navajo, the second largest recognized American tribe in the US. However, the myths about people ending up dead or mysteriously disappearing weren't just because of the Dene people. It started with the discovery of lost gold in the 20th century by two brothers. It's the 14th of July, 1897. Around noon, a steamship arrives on the dock of San Francisco Harbor. At first, nothing seems out of the ordinary, until a few minutes later, some passengers walk out of the ship. They look very rough and unkempt, in rag clothes and tangled hair. Locals around the area began to gather around the harbor. Everyone was curious, not because of the strange-looking people, but because of what they had with them. Very heavy suitcases and canisters. Some of these passengers made a beeline to the closest smelting stations. There, they revealed the contents of their cargo. These northerners had retrieved massive tons of raw northern gold. There was an uproar. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. To say the news spread like wildfire would be an understatement. This was the headline. An extraordinary gold strike had been made in northwestern Canada. This part of Canada was known as the Klondike, and just like that, the race was on for the gold. People from all walks of life headed directly towards Klondike. Many were abandoning their day jobs, traveling cross-country for this chance at wealth. Throughout the course of the Klondike gold rush, more than 100,000 people from all over the world set out to find gold. About 30,000 of them reached their destination. Half of those searched for gold. A quarter of that half found anything meaningful. After several months of searching and digging, only a few hundred struck it rich. But one thing was consistent among all the accounts of people who went gold digging: stories of strange marks in the woods, sounds, and encounters with unfamiliar creatures. Russell and Lee said they saw tracks that appeared to be those of mammoths. Then, Captain Samuel of the American military testified that he also encountered a mysterious white deer in the valley. He mentioned that the springs were strangely ice cold in the summer and warm during winter. Everything about this valley seemed strange, but perhaps the most popular account of the hunt for gold would be that of the McLeod brothers. One day, in 1903, Fred McLeod came across a tall Nahanni hunter. He had paid for his goods with raw gold, and Fred could hardly believe it. He had heard stories about the famous Klondike gold rush, but had his doubts. Well, not anymore. After the hunter revealed where he had discovered his gold, Fred sent word to his elder brother, Willie. A couple of months later, Willie and Frank McLeod headed up the river into the Nahanni Valley, and with luck on their side, they found gold. Later that year, the McLeod brothers struck it big. They found a decent quantity of gold from some Nahanni Creek beds along their journey. But just like big lottery winners of today, they squandered it all, spending most of their gold on poker games. Shortly afterward, both brothers decided to return to Nahanni, believing that more fortune awaited them. If they could find it the first time, surely they would the second time. This time, their younger brother Charles tagged along. On their journey, they met another search party, some Dene and some Nahanni Indians. They actually had some success finding gold nuggets, which were worth $3 each. Well, back in those times, $3 meant a lot. Nonetheless, the band wasn't about to disclose where they had found their gold. The brothers checked around the site and found some gold, but on their journey back home, they mysteriously lost it all. There was nothing to show for their expedition. But that wasn't a worry for them. They knew where to go for unlimited cash, like some sort of cheat code in a game. Flash forward to next spring, Frank and Willie were ready to embark on another gold hunt. This time, Charlie stayed behind, but they had a new partner, Scottish steamboat engineer Robert Ware. He was a supplier for the McLeod family, and when he agreed to fund the search that spring, the brothers agreed. That winter, the brothers didn't return, but there was no worry. Both McLeod brothers were seasoned outdoorsmen. They had grown up with Nahanni Indians and were expert hunters and trappers. Nonetheless, seasons came and went. No sign of Frank or Willie. In May of 1908, Charlie McLeod arranged a search party to find out just what had happened to his brothers. And what he discovered was so disturbing that he never remained the same again. Most corners of the Nahanni Valley are riddled with roaring currents and difficult terrain to climb. Coupled with the fact that strange wild animals were on the loose, Nahanni Valley wasn't your typical walk in the park. After the search party passed the first canyon, they entered a strange bowl-like section of the valley. Many hours of searching had gone by with nothing. They were about to call it quits when they found a message left by one of the brothers. Something was scribbled on a carriage. It read, "We have found a fine prospect." Well, this meant two things. One, they had come through here, and two, there was a huge chance they were nearby. After a little more searching at the entrance of the second canyon, Charlie finally found his brothers. Well, what remained of them. Right there on the ground of the canyon were two headless skeletons. They appeared to be adult and human-sized. One of the skeletons was found on its back, and the other reaching towards his gun, now rusted. Charlie was furious and confused. What could have done this? And most importantly, why were they headless? After searching the area for some clues, Charles discovered a box containing fine gold. This meant his brothers had truly struck gold before they were killed. But something was missing, or should I say someone. Robert Ware. There were no bones, no hair, nothing. It's almost as if he never journeyed with the McLeod brothers. Some theories attempt to explain what happened to the brothers. One Corporal Meller concluded that the brothers had lost their canoe along with their supplies and were killed in a freak accident. Around that time, another skeleton was found 3 miles from the valley. It was assumed that this was Robert Ware. Another fraction of locals believed that the McLeods might have lost their canoe on the violent currents of the South Nahanni. Others assumed that they contracted a disease and passed away. Despite the official narrative, many residents of the area held contrary beliefs. But no matter how you spin the story, Frank and Willie were professionals. Even if they had suffered from the waves or lost supplies, they could have easily come back for help. Foul play was evident. The McLeod brothers had been murdered. After careful analysis, Charlie McLeod reached this conclusion, and he was going to search for Robert with everything in his power. When Royal Northwest Mounted Police looked into some of the rumors, they concluded that they were baseless. It was at this point Charlie decided to take matters into his own hands, track down every single rumor that turned up, and eventually something would budge, right? One such rumor led Charlie up the Pacific coast to Ketchikan, Alaska. He had learned that Robert was living in Vancouver, so he went there, and weirdly and luckily enough, found Robert. Over a bottle of drink, Robert recounted how he and the McLeod brothers had encountered hostile Indians upon entering the Nahanni Valley. According to Robert, the trio were shot at and harassed at every turn by the Nahanni. Eventually, they decided to part ways, splitting their gold. Of course, Charlie didn't believe the man one bit, but he had no proof yet. Over the next couple of weeks, he kept visiting Robert to gain more knowledge about his brother's disappearance. Charlie wasn't satisfied. He returned to inspect his brother's skeletons. After proving to himself that Robert was responsible, he set heels for Vancouver to get some justice. But this time, Robert was in the wind. Charlie had come so close to his brother's killer. Now Robert was gone. Many years after Robert's escape, Charlie purchased a farm and began living in Alberta. In a twist of fate, one of those days, he learned that Robert was working close by. Tracking him would be easy. Charlie had done so most of his life. He found Robert with ease at a farmhouse. Robert saw him and ran. It was a brief chase through trees and grounds of dirt. Before Charlie reached him, Robert locked himself in a barn and shot himself. Later reports reveal that the sparks from the gun caused the barn to burn down. So what do you think? Was Charlie right? I mean, after all, Robert did run from him. You wouldn't do that unless you were guilty of something. But let's rewind to 1908, a few months after the death of the McLeod brothers. Word had spread that these brothers had found gold. Perhaps they weren't qualified for the journey, and that's why they died, aka couldn't be me syndrome. A handful of people heard this news and began their search for the lost gold, and they also met the same headless fate as the brothers. Before long, the valley would be renamed as the Headless Valley because of the sheer number of headless corpses found. Bear in mind that many people had disappeared before the McLeod brothers. What about them? What caused their disappearance? And more importantly, what was making people headless? The following year after the brothers' case, Martin Jorgensen went into the Nahanni Valley in search of lost gold. Early accounts state that Martin was healthy and an expert woodsman. He traveled and searched, but came up with nothing. During one journey in 1913, Martin partnered up with Poole Field. He happened to be looking for gold as well. According to the story, Martin was separated from his party for some reason that year. Now, there are several versions of this case on the internet. If you break all versions down to the core, you are left with two things. 1. Martin's cabin was reduced to ashes, and 2. His skeleton was found headless. On September 28, 1914, Poole Field discovered the disturbing scene in a creek within the valley. Poole claims Martin's bones were found within the ashes of the cabin with an empty bucket beside him. The theory suggested here was that he was getting water to douse the flames burning his cabin, only to be shocked by something. He made a run for it, but was struck down. Some theories on the matter claim he was 60 meters from his cabin and lying next to a loaded rifle. Some describe an apparent fight for his life, but one consistent detail about the many variations was that Martin's skull was nowhere to be found. These were the words from Poolfield himself.
After rooting around for a while, there seemed to be a pretty well cut out trail leading up the river, so I started following it out. About 45 meters from the cabin, there was a bunch of large spruce, and the trail made a short turn around it. Just here, I found an axe in the trail. I picked it up, and just around behind the tree, I found Martin's bones, or what was left of them. His gun lay close by, loaded and cocked. We never found his skull, although we stayed all next day to examine the place well.
How Martin was killed is still a mystery to this day. Throughout the 20th century, hundreds of thousands of people searched for the lost gold mine in the Nahanni Valley. One of the most persistent quests was by none other than Albert Fail. He searched for 35 years of his life, from 1927 to 1962, with a total of 8 journeys. In 1962, following Albert's 8th and final journey, the National Film Board of Canada produced Nahanni, a documentary film. Albert was famously quoted saying, "I'll be dead or drowned before I quit." Way to jinx it. His search came to a sudden halt in 1972 when the Canadian Prime Minister designated Nahanni Valley as a national park. 2 years later, it was inscribed on the World Heritage List. This meant no more gold expeditions. However, so far we've considered 2 angles to this mystery: that they were caused by man, which you could interpret as the Naha, or some wild animals around the Nahanni Valley. But there's a third angle. Within the lore of the Dene tribe and the Nahanni people, some legends describe a curse hanging over the valley, specifically its gold. The rate at which people disappeared or vanished was unheard of. Perhaps there was something more sinister at work here. Well, there was. After the death of Martin Jorgensen, many began to speculate that there was something else at play in the Nahanni Valley, perhaps not man-made. Frank, Willie, Martin, and many others had encountered this entity and had lost their heads shortly after. For some years, the possibility of such a curse kept many at bay. It wasn't worth risking their lives for. The curse hanging over Nahanni was clear for all to see. If you came looking for gold, you had to risk your life as well. However, some people didn't quite believe in the legend. They had to see for themselves. Famous last words. On the 27th of January in 1922, John O'Brien left his cabin to inspect some creeks. He was expected to return in 8 to 10 days. Not surprisingly, John failed to return. After a month, his partner went out to look for him. Some days later, John was found. His frozen corpse on a rocky bed near the mountain's peak. Now, in some cases, a skeleton turns up with no head. In some cases, the bodies were burnt. None of these cases explain May Lafferty's sudden disappearance. By all accounts, she seems to have vanished without logical explanation. In the summer of 1921, May, younger cousin of Poolfield's wife, tagged along with Pool and his wife on their journey through Nahanni country. A few days before their journey, May was feeling unwell and wanted to head back home to her folks, but she ended up staying with the Fields. One day, while the trio was following an Indian trail, May Lafferty suddenly disappeared. Initially, the rest of the party assumed she had wandered into a nearby bush and lost her way, but as the day got darker, the Fields became very concerned. The journey was immediately halted to find May Lafferty, and all hands were on deck. Pool took an elite search party of native hunters and swiftly combed the wilderness for any signs of May. Within several minutes, they picked up her trail and traced her steps back to the woods. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the hunters moved ever so swiftly. Then, they noticed something strange about May's trail. Her prints were very faint on the ground. It was almost like she knew these grounds as well as the native hunters. The prints did not indicate any sign of a lost person, but rather someone who knew the terrain well. This was the first strange thing. The second strange thing: how was she moving so quickly? The hunters tracked May's footprints for a total of 9 days. Along the trail, they found articles of her clothing in several spots, tree branches, some on the ground. By all indications, she was running naked through the woods like a female Tarzan. Here's the third thing. If she was that exposed, how was she surviving the mosquitoes? Even the native hunters mentioned how they couldn't accomplish such a task. Yet May's trails led up into the mountains. At this point, Poole and the hunters were deep in the mountains when they found her hand and footprints on some cliffs. They hypothesized that she climbed her way to the top. Even the hunters were scared to do this. They had to go round and pick up her tracks. 5 days later, the hunters found her prints visibly on the bottom of a 5,000-foot mountain. According to Poole, no sane person would attempt to climb such a mountain, but the hunters decided to check the mountaintop to be sure. Lo and behold, they found her tracks. It seemed like she was heading in the direction of her home, but to this day, she has never been found. May's case was very strange indeed. One by one, bodies keep turning up in this mysterious valley. A Yukon fisher skeleton was found headless on one of Charlie McLeod's expeditions. A year after that, Angus Hall vanishes just like May Lafferty. One Phil Power was also found dead the very next year. You get the idea. Chances are, if you go visiting Nahanni Valley in search of gold, fur, or valuables, you will probably lose your head or vanish. Some reports even recorded that some gold searchers went mad, but the reasons as to why were not clearly stated. Over several decades, a couple of theories have surfaced. The most prevalent of such is that the Nahanni Valley is a haunted place by ghosts and spirits. According to the Dene, the spirit they all feared the most was the one that dwelt in the South Nahanni River. As the tale goes, on windy nights the spirit could make men vanish like smoke in the wind, and you could sometimes hear the spirit wailing in the canyons. Well, that's pretty frightening, but not so much when compared to the rest of the greater spirits. Now, to understand what was truly going on at the Nahanni Valley, we have come to a general understanding of the Dene beliefs. The Dene believe certain spirits roam the area in the Nahanni Valley. The spirit of cold. This would explain the random cases of sudden freezing to death and excessive snowstorms that seemingly appear out of nowhere. The spirit of heat. This could be another explanation for several cabin immolations found in the valley. Another would be the wind spirit. Locals in the area claim to hear wailing in the canyons, which correspond to the Dene legend. Of all these, the Dene claim that the Sao Nai is the most powerful, with the ability to strike diseases upon anyone. If you didn't believe the spirits, I wouldn't blame you. These deaths could quite easily be explained by the kind of animals in the valley. Many critics stand firm on the fact that nothing mysterious was happening in the Nahanni Valley, and people let superstition get the best of them nowadays. Of the strange animals that exist in the valley, many people have encountered such animals, and many of them end up dead. But Frank Graves was one of such people who had an encounter with a strange animal within the valley and lived to tell the tale. According to Frank, he was out one evening when he heard the bush rustle, and at first he thought nothing of it. But suddenly, an enormous white creature, assumed to be a polar bear, came out from the leaves. Only, it wasn't a bear. It was more like a white gigantic dog. It stood straight up with legs like a wolf. Imagine a wolf but 20 times its size. By reflex, Frank fired his gun, but the animal didn't make any sudden movement. Perhaps he missed it. 1 second later, the white animal turned away from him and walked in the other direction. For some reason, Frank fired again. This time the bullet clearly hit its ear, but still made no move toward him. It kept walking. When Frank described the event to his partner a few minutes later, they made haste to sail out of the area. His partner made him understand he had just encountered a wahila said to have existed several million years ago, and his life was spared on a whim. There were also reports of a white bear near Nahanni Valley, which corresponds to Frank Graves' story. Other barbaric tribes also exist within the valley that could have been responsible for the killings at the time. The Nukluk were called juvenile Nakanni people, another group to have existed in the valley. These were creatures who had become feral after committing acts like cannibalism or murder. They had a very similar resemblance to what we now call Sasquatch, but unlike the Sasquatch, they weren't gigantic. In more recent years, sightings of the Nakanni have been recorded. In the fall of 2012, 2 Dene women from Quebec's northern region reported Nahanni sightings. While they were picking berries near a village, both women spotted a strange creature from a distance. They realized it was covered in long, dark hair, very similar to the Nahanni. They estimated the creature was about 3 meters tall and later discovered its footprints to be almost 16 inches long. 4 years after that, on the 28th of July 2016, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation published an article from one of such encounters with a Nahanni. While Tony Willa was on the lake of Lac La Martre, he accidentally tipped his boat over. After struggling for a while to climb into his boat, he swam to shore for some rest. In the blink of an eye, there was a giant man beside him, and at a moment's notice, he had walked away. Tony got to his feet and was later rescued from the beach. The only issue about this story is that it's all eyewitness accounts, but then again, bear in mind there were no iPhones or Instagram Live, so even if they saw it, there was no way to get proof, which could mean that there's a possibility that there was something on that land. Plus, there were actual headless corpses. There was no faking that. There was something on that land that loved eating human heads. And don't say venom. I honestly have so many questions about the Valley of Headless Men. A cool heavy metal name, by the way. But unfortunately, we will never know or find out, since the government has made that place a no-go area. Or, who knows, maybe that's why they made it one.